Hey gang, welcome back to another video. So this week I'll be replicating probably my most obscure prop to date. In fact, this prop is so rare that the best image I could find of it was from this 1980s Topps Star Wars card. But I knew I needed it for my collection. So let's get into making Leia's Comlink from Empire Strikes Back. Admittedly, this prop wasn't something on my radar, but I stumbled across another great thread on the Replica prop forum which kicked off my interest in recreating it. Now that said, before I can get started on the assembly, there are some hard to find parts that I will need to 3D model. If you didn't notice from the photo, half of this build is a small tape measure, which is easy to acquire. The other half is full of parts that are no longer available or quite expensive to buy reproductions of. And since I rarely have a budget for these videos, I'm going to have to model these parts starting with the Unimax safety switch. This part is more known for being on the stock of Boba Fett's EE3 blaster, but the part I need is the opposite side of this switch. So with a few reference photos at the ready, I got down to replicating this part in my 3D modeling software. In the RPF thread, there was a great top-down photo of this prop, so I was able to import it into Fusion, and because I knew the actual dimensions of this part, I could adjust the scale of the image and get to some basic modeling. Once I had the general shape of the Unimax switch, I could get to recreating the knurled cone knobs. Now this part is most notably seen on Luke's lightsaber in Return of the Jedi, and originally these parts are from a Mitchell reference turntable. Now these turntable parts are all over the original Trilogy movies, so having a model of my own will likely come in handy in the future. I repeated this process to create the smaller thumb screws and the knurled rod, and then could get to printing them in resin, since the resolution is higher, which means less sanding for me, and that's always a good thing. And here's all of my parts. Some printed, some real, including this door peephole assembly, which were roughly the same size and shape as what we see on the Comlink. Of course, the biggest surprise part is this Stanley 16-foot tape measure, which you can buy at most hardware stores and online for about $12, which in the replica prop world is an absolute steal. But before I can get to assembling, I'll need to disassemble the tape measure. Now, I had no idea how this was going to play out. It would either come apart in its wound up state, or it was going to jump out of the housing and I'd have 16 feet of tape measure causing havoc in my workspace. Thankfully, after removing a few screws, it came out without unraveling and I could get to trimming off the mounting posts. The body of this tape measure is plastic, so I was able to snip them off without any issue and sand them flush with the outer edge so that it'll sit flat on the workbench. With that out of the way, it was time to add a few more holes to the face of the tape measure. I unscrewed the bezels from the two peephole assemblies and used them to determine where I'd need to add holes so that they would sit flush against the tape measure. Then I could add some pilot holes, and eventually use a step-up bit to enlarge the openings. Because the bezels are so much larger than their threading, this opening doesn't have to be exact. In fact, I ended up enlarging it a bit more once I noticed that the placement of the bezels didn't quite match the reference photos of this prop. So it wasn't super important to be accurate for this part of the build. Now that the holes are drilled, I could see just how much of the threading could be removed, and then I threw the assembly into my vise and cut nearly all of it off with a hacksaw. I also took this opportunity to grind a flat spot onto each of the bezels on my bench sander. Having this flat edge not only matches the original prop, but will give me a surface to apply glue to. At this point, I realized there was one more hole that needed to be drilled out of the top of the tape measure, so I quickly drilled it out and then I could move on to the glue up. I'll be using 5-minute epoxy for this prop since I've recently come to the opinion that the hold is better than what I'd get with CA glue. But I also like the fact that I've got a little time to make sure that the pieces are in the right place before the glue sets up. Once the epoxy on the tape measure and the switch housing had cured, I took a second to test fit the bezels, which is when I noticed they weren't quite in the right position. So off camera, I enlarged the holes a bit until their position was correct, and then I could move on to the 3D printed parts. Nearly all of the parts came off the printer just fine and didn't need any major sanding, but the small thumb screws had a pronounced foot on them that I wanted to turn into a chamfer. So I chucked them up in my drill and used some 220 grit sandpaper to give me a better edge profile. Now that all of my 3D printed parts are ready for paint, I grabbed some carpet tape, stuck it to some popsicle sticks, and could stick the 3D parts to it so they don't go flying away when I paint them. And speaking of paint, for these parts I decided to apply paint right over the raw prints with this silver Duplicolor spray paint. The original parts were all machined from metal, most likely aluminum, so they wouldn't have a reflective finish, and this paint gets me a metallic finish that reads a bit more like aluminum and less like chrome. These parts got a few passes with the silver paint and then set out to dry so that I could paint the main body. Now before I can get to that, I'll need to wipe down the tape measure with some isopropyl alcohol because I used Goof Off to remove the yellow sticker and it leaves behind an oil-like coating. So the alcohol will cut through any residue and give me the best chance for good paint adhesion. I applied 2 rounds of primer and gave it some time to dry, and then followed up with a matte gray spray paint that looks similar to the few stills and photographs I've seen of this prop. When the paint was dry, it was time to finish the assembly. So I mixed up a bit more 5-minute epoxy and started gluing in the remaining greeblies, starting with the chrome bezels, which were first glued to each other along the flat edge to make sure it matched the reference. And then I could get to installing the rest of the pieces. And just like that, another obscure prop is added to my collection. Now, while this may not be as exciting as a lightsaber or a blaster, it will fit right in my collection of obscure and inconsequential props. That's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.